I am the wrong hero. I thank you very much for tuning in. Please stay tuned for part 2 of our presentation coming right up. Hi, it's the wrong hero again. Here to bring you part 2 of our presentation entitled Propaganda. Well, when we last left off, I suppose what we were getting at was the military-industrial complex, our old pal, and I don't know. Let's talk about the prison-industrial complex for a moment. Solitary confinement acts on most persons as a powerful stress. Symptoms include superstition, intense love of any other living thing, perceiving inanimate objects as alive, hallucinations and delusions, manipulating time, resetting clocks, odd meal times, disrupted sleep, day-night disorientation, unpatterned questioning, nonsensical questions, ignoring half-hearted cooperation, rewarding non-cooperation. These are the means by which prison keepers, warders, turnkeys, what have you, use to keep prisoners in line. Now, actual raw data is getting thin on the ground here, but I think we can come up with some more political insights. For example, Thomas Jefferson, he was all the vogue back in March. He was never a legend in his own time, always a controversial figure who combined great depth with great shallowness, massive learning with extraordinary naivete, piercing insights into others with daunting powers of self-deception. He developed a distinctly modern style of politics, in statements deliberately written to let different audiences hear what they wish to hear. That's the way it goes in a political climate, particularly in a democracy, I must say. How did Confucius teach? The analects suggest that he taught mainly by focusing on moral questions, which he put to his students in the context of either historical anecdote, personal experience, or broader situational terms. Well, I'll have to keep that in mind when I do my own highly regarded performances. Well, at the time you're watching this, my next performance, speaking of which, will be on September 6th, down at AS220. So I'll see if I can't keep some of those things in mind. Confucius established an enduring and decisive link between education and political power. One may rob an army of its commander-in-chief. One cannot deprive the humblest man of his free will. Without the trust of the people, no government can stand. See, that Confucius was a wise man. He was a wise, wise man. Well, if I had half again as much more time as I actually do, then perhaps I would use that time wisely in sleeping. No, in reading all of these books that I've been wanting to read but haven't had a chance to, such as The Culture of Education by Jerome Bruner, or Cultural Psychology by Michael Cole, or Culture in Mind by Brad Shore, or Thinking Through Cultures by R.A. Schwader, or Cultural Psychology Essays by J. Stigler et al., or Culture Theory Essays by R.A. Schwader and R.A. Levine. But I can only tell you about these things in the hopes that one of you might pick up on one of them. Politics and baseball. Politics versus baseball. One national pastime where the dirt stays on the field. Bill Clinton, He has so much intellectual energy that he has to siphon some of it off in order to be able to think. Solitaire may also satisfy a kind of need to bring order out of chaos and entropy. This is in reference to Bill Clinton's habit of obsessively playing solitaire, even when speaking to principal aides. I'll bet you that the president on Air Force One didn't waste his time on solitaire, but then again, Hollywood is a place of great irony at all times. But someday we'll get beyond the ironic Hollywood, and the scripts will begin working on post-irony, in which all mention or practice of irony is strictly forbidden. U.S. News and World Report has been dragnet to its rivals Law and Order, or NYPD Blue. When it comes to public criticism, no one is more thin-skinned than journalists. James Fallows, editor of U.S. News and World Report, is a fount of dangerous nonsense, according to Howell Raines. I can't believe that people are stupid enough to think the only choice is Izvestia or withering sarcasm, says James Fallows. All this stuff is cited from the New Yorker. By Kurt Anderson. In the 1970s, outside the big cities, news magazines were indispensable as a source of news. The period from Camelot to Nixon's resignation was a golden age. But now, of course, people in big cities and other places have the internet to get their specious, fallacious, slanted news sources from. So that's an improvement, I suppose. Instead of journalists who are trained in deception, we have non-journalists who are mere amateurs at it, and who may eventually, or occasionally, let the truth slip out. James Fallows comes across to some like a John Anderson, a sanctimonious neo-something. Washington particularly hates moralists, Nick Lehman says. The Washington establishment really hates Ralph Nader, and it hated Jimmy Carter. It is an intensely practical-minded city. It is a city that worships Sam Nunn. Show us a moralist, and we can't wait to find the hypocrisy. Such is the pathological skepticism of American journalists, Fallows argues. There are certain people I would like to punch. Like all good moralists, Fallows seems to have a taste for being a pariah. His tenure could do more than simply make U.S. News not bad, a Time without the arts coverage, and a Newsweek with more service pieces. Teddy Kennedy. Many visitors still treat him as a shadow president, an appropriate theme to begin mining as we reach the end of part 2, or approach the end of part 2, of our massive 24-part series on politics. "24 weeks, 26 weeks because we've had to repeat 2 of our programs. That's actually an entire TV season. And I have, of course, been spending it in the way that I know best. Talking about the thing I love, myself. I guess we'll probably wrap this up by mid-November. Although who's to say, it might go all the way to the end of December. We take 2 weeks off at the end of December and 1 week off in November. A Democrat can't win if you lose Kennedy. By the way, one of Teddy Kennedy's many hobbies is painting, even though he was allegedly, or is allegedly, more relaxed when in motion. He avoids painting people because he can't get them right. Bill Clinton. A lot of people have great skills in Congress and aren't great politicians in an electoral sense. Then there are a lot of people who are great politicians who don't understand the moves, you know. He's as good as what he does as Michael Jordan is at playing basketball. I mean, he can always see the opening. He's got lateral vision, and it's uncanny what he can do. This is Bill Clinton talking about Ted Kennedy, who came in for a lot of attention in the New Yorker in the issue dated March 31st. Eventually, we're shading into April in our coverage of political things, or I should say things political. In the magazine George from April of 1997, Earl Crittenden refers to Laura Ingraham as the bombshell GOP hatchet woman. TV pundit bragged that her folding fur was made from squealing baby foxes. A woman after my own heart. Fred Barnes, George Will Light, graying prepster who defers to his elders, edits the Weekly Standard. Sam Donaldson, Mr. Spock with Type A tantrums. Gore, Lamar, Thompson, Nashville's White House wannabes. Well, Emmanuel Rahm, White House Chief of Staff, used to jump on top of his desk so as to have a better vantage from which to scream at his underlings. He has never not succeeded, according to Richard Blow. Insiders know that if one wanted to be a White House player, returning to the First Lady's good graces was one, mandatory, and two, about as likely as escaping a deserted island in a bathtub, says Richard Blow in George magazine of April 1997. To survive requires a poker face. If you let your vulnerability show, someone's going to come along and stick a sword in the chink, says Dee Dee Myers, former press secretary, cited by Richard Blow. 10 ways to get a lawmaker's attention. Hire his spouse. Announce a third party against the incumbent. Enlist a celebrity. Send knickknacks. Woo the opinion media. Devise a mascot. Find a political bedfellow, strange or otherwise. Jam the communications portals. Retire the legislator's debt. Employ large numbers of constituents. These are all tips that are given to us by Ned Martell. Now here's something you probably didn't know. Arizona Governor Fife Symington is the grandson of Henry Clay Frick, a name which may not mean much around here, but in Pittsburgh it means quite a bit. He was one of Carnegie's underlings who got tremendously wealthy because of shrewd investments. U.S. police agencies have long monitored threatening groups, but investigations are rarely made public unless arrests occur or scandals emerge, says Russ Baker. Speaking of Scientologists. Some Scientologists who lack the funds to pay for courses are strongly urged to join what is called the Sea Organization, a Scientology branch whose members wear faux naval uniforms, bunk in Spartan quarters, and work long days for little pay. Why, my former across-the-hall mates at 494 Mass Ave were members of that organization, or at least they were always getting their mail. In 1980, 11 Scientologists, including Hubbard's wife, were imprisoned for infiltrating, burglarizing, and wiretapping more than 100 government and private agencies in an attempt to block investigations of the Scientologists. Scientology publications routinely accuse critics of all kinds of salacious acts, from collecting porno to dancing nude. L. Ron Hubbard in the 1950s, he exuded evil malice and stupidity, but perfectly amiable to talk to, says Gore Vidal, cited by Russ Baker. An institution that should always fight for progress and reform, never tolerate injustice or corruption, always fight demagogues of all parties, never belong to any party, always oppose privileged classes and public plunderers, never lack sympathy with the poor, always remain devoted to the public welfare, never be satisfied with merely printing news, always be drastically independent, never be afraid to attack wrong, whether by predatory plutocracy or predatory poverty. This is the bronze plaque on the offices of the New York World. My time is too valuable to waste in an effort to supply the man in the street with his daily quota of cliches, said Harry S. Truman back in 1961. I'm coming to New York. Oh no, I'm sorry, that was Hunter S. Thompson, not Harry S. Truman. My mistake. My time is too valuable to waste in an effort to supply the man in the street with his daily quota of cliches. I'm coming to New York on a chopped hog and shoot him in the gut with an expanding filth flare, says Hunter S. Thompson in 1965. Hunter S. Thompson, masterful American prose stylist and journalistic fictionalist, creating chaos to undercut his most cherished schemes, courting self-destruction as the avenue to success, maintaining a symbiotic colloquy with cosmic despair, and coping with rejection through Avengers rhetoric. His tools: bizarre wit, mockery without end, redundant excess, supreme self-confidence, the narrative of the wounded meritorious ego, and the idiopathic anger of the righteous outlaw. In all our early marathon conversations, a recurring subject was writers of originality, how the power of language set them apart, how their story, not their ideas, was supreme, and for an idea to find house room, it needed embodiment in the narrative, or it was worthless. The notion of coming at the reader with fangs dripping wisdom was as laughable as it was useless. Hunter S. Thompson identified with literary outsiders, Salinger and Dunleavy, learned from Mencken how to be an attack dog, cheered for Nelson Algren and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Nathaniel West, memorized Dylan Thomas and Faulkner, new forms of fiction, by writing what seemed to be journalism while actually you are developing your fictional oeuvre. The best fiction is far more true than any kind of journalism, and the best journalists have always known this, says Faulkner. Well, you could say the same for comic strips as well. You know, I don't read Maclean's very carefully. It's like the Canadian version of Time, Newsweek, or actually U.S. News and World Report. But they do have some handy tips put out by the Milk Council on how to avoid osteoporosis. And that, I fear, is its chief value to me. Well, the percentage of people likeliest to go to heaven. When asked in a survey which people were likeliest to go to heaven, 87% selected themselves, according to U.S. News and World Report of March 31st, 79% Mother Teresa, 66% Oprah, 65% Michael Jordan, 61% Colin Powell. Notice that all of these folks are people of color. 60% Princess Diana, 55% Gore and Hillary Rodham Clinton, 52% Bill Clinton, 47% Pat Robertson, 40% Newt, 28% Dennis Rodman, and 19% selected OJ as a person likeliest to go to heaven. People with near-death experiences become enamored with the spiritual part of life and less so with possessions, power, and prestige. Although let me assure you that this wears off after a while. More notable changes of a near-death experience include heightened zest for life, unconditional love of all humans. They can see the good in all people. They act fairly naive, and they often allow themselves to be opened up to con men who abuse their trust. Having stared eternity in the face, they lose their need for ego-boosting achievement. Gee, sounds to me like you're being ruined. An 8-year-old with cancer envisioning a school bus being driven by Jesus. A 7-year-old leukemia patient hearing a chorus of angels before passing away. Well, that's nice. Of course, you can get the same effects with ketamine, also known as Special K, which, medically speaking, is an out-of-body neurotransmitter. Out-of-body conditions can also be induced by massive centrifugal force. Scientists say it's an evolutionary adaptation produced by opiate-like compounds called endorphins. Outlaw my brain, it's got opiate receptors. The drug trade, according to In These Times of March 31st, has become like the national debt. Both are treated as evils on the front page and assets on the business page. Illegal drugs have the distinction of being the only global industry that the media choose to cover from the bottom up rather than the top down. The last thing the big-time drug industry wants is a beloved stupeficant that any fool can grow in a flower pot. The favorite solution to every problem in America is to make more product. The U.S. has tired of being the world's cop. Instead, the U.S. has opted to become the world's police commissioner. Commissioners leave the day-to-day management of cops to subordinates. They get good seats on the gravy train. The aging American empire has settled into Ottoman-style corruption. It's a mark of imperial degeneracy when leaders tire of the glories of conquest and lounge around taking bribes from the parvenus of once subject states. So we are today awash in scandals in which representatives of the rising trading nations of Asia buy off bits and pieces of the American empire from those pledged to defend and extend it. After the Nixon years, we cried out for a more open government. When we got it, we were unable to resist pillorying it. China is where the money is. Never mind that it is a Stalinist government with crony capitalism grafted onto the economy, according to the Progressive of April 1997. I see by the 1941 birth records that the Reverend Jesse Jackson is the same age as Cheerios. Sheriff Joe Arpaio unveiled the nation's first female chain gangs on a downtown Phoenix street. Media is a closed circuit. Nobody gets on that circuit that you don't want. Gee, I get it. Finally. Well, some sad news about the media. 99.2% of cities have only one daily paper. There are 1,500 cities with dailies. It's homogenized news and the cheapest news. Local news is expensive. You have to pay a reporter a salary, benefits, and a pension plan. Whereas if you have a lot of fluff and entertainment and syndicated stuff, you have a machine that produces it at negligible cost. If it weren't for the alternatives, there'd be very little differentiation in voice and content. It's not whether the customers are happy, it's whether the Wall Street analysts are happy and what's happening to the stock. Decisions in the newspaper business are now being made by Wall Street analysts. Those naughty, naughty Wall Street analysts. For whom it is infinitely convenient to blame all of the problems of media. And with good reason. When you get a local publisher, top editor who has stock options, the money they save on the news is money in their pocket. They get rewarded for giving the community as little real news as possible. This, of course, is a trend that the Wrong Hero is dedicated to correcting. But of course, what are his bloviations, after all, but merely news read practically verbatim from the very sinister news magazines which supposedly are part of the problem. Very little of this data actually comes from newspapers, but rather from magazines. Tobacco companies own big food companies. They are our only killer with a huge advertising budget. Nevertheless, still from the progressive, Ben Bagdakian, the honest job of the journalist is to observe, to listen, to learn. The job of the celebrity is to be observed, to make others learn about him or her, to be the object of attention rather than an observer of some object. Television. The screen cannot stay unchanged for more than 2 or 3 seconds. People who advertise on television want what they call a good atmosphere for the ad. Real objectivity is a kind of uniformity. What I like better is fairness and balance. I do believe every generation must recreate the reality against certain kinds of illusions. You have to propagate rationality, humanism, what we have learned in the history of the human race, and that's never over. You have to do it every single generation. People don't mind an amateurish production if it's on a subject they are keen about. Very often, ordinary citizens are absolutely eloquent about what they really care about in their own neighborhoods. Well, now, LBJ was concerned that if he didn't wrap up the Vietnam War, or if he tried to leave the Vietnam War, and the Vietnamese in the lurch, that he would be impeached. A startling revelation, which has only recently come out and come back to haunt his legacy. You can hire an expert to say just about anything, says Preston Lerner. It has become an underground river, the populist anger about the effects of economic globalization, says David Ignatius. Global capitalism is strong and supple, a machine that reaps as it destroys, says William Reeder. The contradictions of capitalism that originally inspired Karl Marx's critique are enduring, largely unchallenged, and uncorrected. We have become a nation good at snipping and sniping, but instinctively mistrustful of grand abstractions. The range of respectable opinion these days is amazingly narrow. The desirability of global trade is a settled issue for most intellectuals, and not just economists. The Cold War is over. The forces of the free market have triumphed. History isn't a straitjacket. It doesn't move in one direction. Things that look ruinous in the abstract often turn out not to be in the practical ebb and flow of the real world. The great convulsions of human affairs tend to come from places where the theorists haven't been looking. The rise of anti-Semitism in Germany, the splitting of the atom, the invention of the microchip. As our economy has shifted gears over the last 20 years, the richest Americans have been capturing an ever larger share of the national income, more at any other time since the 1890s. The American steel industry was an early victim of globalization. A profit generation, according to the book The Fourth Turning by Howell and Strauss, is born during a high and upbeat era of strengthening institutions and weakening individualism. A nomad generation is born during an awakening, a passionate era of spiritual upheaval. A hero generation is born during an unraveling, a downcast era of strengthening individualism and weakening institutions. An artist generation is born during a crisis, a decisive era of secular upheaval, when the old civic order is being brushed away. Of course, I am a prophet generation. My son will be born as part of the hero generation, soon and unraveling. The Constitution says that everyone's entitled to an attorney of their choice, but the Constitution does not say that the lawyer has to be awake. Bright has documented dozens of hair-raising cases involving both court-appointed and privately hired death penalty trial lawyers, according to The Nation of April 7th. Lawyers who spent the trial drunk, who slept, lawyers who called their client little nigger boy, lawyers who couldn't recite a single criminal statute or case. Sobering thought. So, if you get caught in a death penalty case, make sure that your lawyer is related to you in some way. So, GOP 2000, Forbes, Kemp, Buchanan. Here's a test for insanity. Put someone in a room with an overflowing sink and a mop, and then see if he tries to mop up the mess or just turns off the tap. Speaking of which, Governor Pataki fits the profile of the New England establishment Republican willing to reduce taxes some, but unwilling to cut government deeply. And yet Pataki is mentioned as a possible front runner in the GOP. Doing some notation work here. You know, there are many different things we could have called this particular presentation. We could have called it fractional reserve, for example, but we didn't. Why? Good question. only connect. The point is that we should learn to connect what has become discounted in public life, says Nicholas Walter, citing E.M. Forster in Howard's End, where that famous phrase, only connect, first appeared. Well, now here's a whole bunch of stuff about Charlie Chaplin. Not really quite on the subject. I do tend to stray from the subject on occasion. When will our politicians learn that what is morally wrong is never legally right? Asks Leland Chu. NYPD. Educators and libertarians blast the plan to use school yearbook photos to identify suspects. Julia Child says that if you give up butter, in about 10 years you'll get dandruff. Well, that's a point, but was man created to eat butter and other butter-type products? Or was he created for a higher purpose in life? To be the stimulus that drives the agents of commerce. Newt Gingrich is starting to learn that you need to define victory in ways that you can achieve it. Well, here's some interesting stuff about tax fraud. Well, before that, here's a very sad but interesting story. In Gustave Flaubert's story, A Simple Heart, an old French woman pines for her beloved nephew, a sailor who has disappeared in Cuba. Later, she acquires a parrot. Because it comes from the Americas, it reminds her of him. When the parrot dies, she has it stuffed and set in her room, among her items of religious veneration. On her deathbed, she has a vision of heaven. The clouds part to reveal an enormous parrot. Now, isn't that a touching tale? Some members thought that reaffirmation would bring back the old big think follow me to Armageddon newt. Instead, they got a warm and fuzzy tickle me newty. Here we go. The odds of being prosecuted for tax crimes are about the same as for being murdered on the street. 17 in 1 million. Fewer than 4 of every 10,000 non-filers ever get caught. IRS technology has remained stagnant. If the IRS were a business, its accountants would not be able to sign off on its financial statements, says Richard Stengel. Do you know that there is an online cinema on the internet at www.afionline.org/cinema. Now here's some interesting data about John Wayne. The Gary Wills biography of John Wayne having just come out in April. By 1979, when he died, most of us no longer found the ideal of the frontier very useful. Our culture had ceased to celebrate people who bound their lives to the defense of the simple moralities that Wayne embodied, moralities that even liberals, deploring his reactionary politics, found they missed. Wayne's legend, his apparent immortality, the sources of which keep eluding Wills, derive from that curiously haunting sense of loss. And now, on the whole UFO flap. But before that, America's greatest contribution to the world of ideas is adolescence. European novels often begin with a first indelible memory, a golden poplar or mamo standing in the kitchen. American novels begin at the moment of rebellion, the moment of appetite for distance. The moonless night, Tom Sawyer pries open the back bedroom window, shinnies down the drainpipe, drops to the ground, and runs, says Richard Rodriguez. The earliest Americans imagined that they had fled the past, motherland, fatherland, and had come upon land that was without history or meaning. By implication, the earliest Americans imagined themselves adolescents, orphans. Their task was self-creation without benefit or burden of family. The myth we must each create in our meaning has passed down through American generations. For example, Babbitt, if you want an example. The New Age movement, a collection of religious practices, therapy techniques, witchcraft, science fiction, and alternative medicine. A now well-established parallel universe of alternative theology and a widespread fascination with paranormal phenomena, self-exploration, and spirituality in general. After all, the whole idea of the New Age is that some kind of New Age is going to dawn. To Richard Smalley, the addition of UFOs and extraterrestrials to the New Age soup is easy to explain. They are the postmodern equivalents of ghosts, angels, fairies, elves, the 20th century rebuilding of pagan pantheons. People have always seen the earth as inhabited by conscious beings other than ourselves. Today, the mythic sensibility has been affected enough by science that people see those other intelligences as extraterrestrial. Jung, writing about flying saucers in 1958, saw belief in such phenomena as a projection of a higher self to which humans aspire, channeling the 20th century equivalent of the Orakai at Delphi, 19th century table rapping. The net surfer can send his spirit around the world, literally shedding his container. People affiliate with religions, but people become addicted to cults. As Applewhite said, you can follow us, but you can't stay here and follow us. Well, you know, things come, things go. I mean, nobody talks about the Odyssey anymore. Or at least everybody's talking about the Odyssey, but nobody's doing anything about it. Hi, I'm the wrong hero. And you are tuned to my presentation of Sins of... Wait a minute, which one is this? Yeah, oh, propaganda, that's it. We're talking propaganda here. See, it's hard for me to keep track. And speaking of propaganda, do I have your permission to begin to come to a conclusion with a rather lengthy quote about everybody's favorite nemesis, television? Yes, the very television you watch is to some the focus of all evil in the modern world. And yet, if it weren't for television, I wouldn't be bringing you this presentation, which I think is much the better for having been broken into 2 segments rather than a 2-hour-long tour de force at one sitting. If I do say so myself, television is the force of no history, and it holds the archives of the history of no history. No good has come of it. A little span of time made friendlier by repetition. In a way, it doesn't exist at all. It is by the use of false love that television succeeds, the love engendered by familiarity. False love is the aesthetic of the hit. What is loved is a hit. What is a hit is loved. The back and forth of this establishes a context. It's so intimate. It's like waking up with a friend, but just for a minute. In the absence of adults, people come to put their trust in experts. An important role of a father is to give a son a sense of permission, a sense of what might be done. This still works, but since no adult is supported by the voice of the culture, which is now a childish voice, it does not work well. This is thought to be an age of gossip, but that is because people know that it is a small time, and they assume that the small things they have discussed are gossip, because they feel, correctly, that the things they hear and want to hear and insist on hearing are beneath history. Magazines know that they have no authority apart from the demographic makeup of their audience. And this is George W.S. Trow, who also said, "It was the role of television to establish the context of no context and then chronicle it. I have made sense of my life by developing an ability to analyze mainstream American cultural artifacts," says George W.S. Trow, quoted in the New York Times Book Review of April 6th. Remember, the referee always wins. We don't have as much news as we have commentary on the news. Wonder was the grace of the century, says George W.S. Trow in his book Within the Context of No Context, published in 1980, recently reissued. To make war, you must understand the mind of the opposing commander. You can never outmaneuver him unless you understand him, and you can't understand him unless you understand his literature and his language. This is a citation by Chris Wine in the same journal. With the exception of the Incredible Hulk's Dr. Bruce Banner, no one undergoes more startling metamorphoses than the Vice President. His transformation from bloodless boar to barrel of monkeys has been noted repeatedly over half a decade. "Leaden on the hustings as a wintry sky," said the New York Times. This is quoted from the Weekly Standard of March 31st. Men in the male menopause years are likely to be jerks. They like to be jerks. If you'll notice any obnoxious middle-aged white male who writes a book, has it become an instant bestseller? Lee Iacocca, Bobby Knight, Alan Dershowitz, etc. Similarly, any loudmouth jerk of the same age immediately captures a large jerk constituency. Perot, Le Pen, Bossy. That's because middle-aged men have worked hard for a bunch of years, they've achieved a certain measure of success, and they feel they've earned the right to be selfish and obnoxious. They like reading about and voting for insufferable jerks like them, conspicuously demonstrating their own smug self-satisfaction. Cigar Aficionado is the perfect excessiporn magazine. It describes a product that you have to destroy in order to use. You have to keep buying more, which is good for advertisers, says David Brooks. Newt Gingrich leads us to the painful recognition of the problem with revolutionary figures. They are rarely the right people to govern after the revolution. A prescient thing to say, and of course there's more of this anti-Newt talk here in July than there was back in April. Peter King, representative from Long Island, says that Newt Gingrich is the most powerful liberal in American politics. Roadkill on the highway of American politics. Why can't we have normal speakers of the House like what's his face? You know, the old guy, the fat guy, the American Express guy, Speaker of the House. What was his name? You know the guy I mean. He wrote a book. Tip O'Neill. Yeah, that's who. You know, back when Tip was running things, if you insulted him, you would lose your next election. Not so with Newt, who apparently can be insulted and even virtually assaulted with impunity. Nowadays, o tempore, o mores. A prominent Democrat received a fundraising letter from the Republican Party. The Post thinks such commonplace anecdotes still make a cute story. they don't, well, the chasm between sensibilities, between the American desire for the appearance of action and the Chinese obsession with the appearance of order, is the conundrum at the heart of Sino-American relations, says Joe Klein, in a source that I am not instantaneously prepared to cite, except it was the New Yorker from April 7th. Gore has always seemed a natural-born Confucian, respectful of his elders, deferential to his superiors, ever loyal, a perfect protege. Gore's tendency to err on the side of starched propriety is the personal quality that served his China mission well. That's all for now, but we'll be bringing you more at a future time. This has been Cafe Cabaret. Tune in.